Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going over this inverter generator here from Champion. It is the 2000 watt. However, that's kind of misleading. It's a 2000 watts max. It's not rated for consistent 2000 watts. I believe it's 1700 watts on that regard. Anyway, basically we have just had 2 hurricanes here in the Carolinas, and I have this inverter generator, I have a regular generator, and then I have a smaller inverter generator, and wanted to go over sort of how this one here has performed throughout the last 2 storms, the features of it, and what I think of it overall. So first off, why would you want an inverter generator versus a normal generator? So a normal generator typically is going to run around 3,600 RPMs in order to give, in the US, what we want in terms of power output being 120 volts. Those ones tend to be bigger, heavier. A lot of them require steel frames, but they can give you a lot more power than what you're typically going to get with an inverter generator. Inverter generators are typically going to give you about 1,000 watts to about 4,000 watts. So this one here is sort of in between. But the inverter generators are going to give you cleaner power. In terms of consistency of the output. It's also going to be more fuel efficient, generally speaking. They're also going to be smaller, which you guys can see here. This one's pretty small. It's also relatively lightweight. It weighs about 40 pounds with no fluids in it. With the fluids and gas in it, it weighs around 45 pounds. So it absolutely is man portable. I mean, I wouldn't go on a hike with it, but you can throw it in your vehicle easily, walk it out to a campsite, something like that. And it's very portable in that regard. Inverter generators, for the amount of power you're going to put out, are generally going to be a little bit more expensive than your traditional generators, again, for equal amounts of power. But pros and cons to each for sure. This one, like I said, we've been running it for the last probably month and a half. We've probably ran it a total of about 6 days because we had 2 hurricanes come through and lost power during both of them. So we've got some hours on it at this point. A few things to kind of go over here first before we get into the performance and how it works and all that jazz. Basically, we have our little output signals here. The low oil, in theory, it's supposed to turn off when that light comes on if the oil actually is low. And then we have our output and our overload. The overload, in my experience, will actually turn the generator off, which we'll get into that here in just a second. We have our choke here for starting it. Then we have our 2 different modes for running the actual generator itself, the economy, and then the standard full bore there, the engine itself on and off switch, and then our gasoline on and off switch. So that's the basics there. This is our charging cable. We have our ground piece here. Now I should also mention that inverter generators are inherently grounded. So there's no need to actually put an external ground to them. However, if you want to, it gives you the ability to do it, but you're sort of wasting your time. There's no need to do that. We also have the 2 120 volt outputs, and then we have our DC output here. And the DC output, we should kind of mention that here real quick, is for charging batteries. So if a lot of campsites, the guys are going to have their equipment set up with battery powered stuff. You plug this in, and then you just hook this up to your batteries, and you can charge batteries through that DC output there. And that's kind of the basics on the front. We have our fuel cap here on top. Mine is broken. We'll touch on that here in just a second. And then on the back side, we'll get into that real quick. As you can see, again, I can flip it around just with my normal strength, I guess you could say. It's not super heavy. And we have this panel on the back. That's to make it quieter. And just some typical Phillips head screws here to take it off. We'll open it up and get into that. We have those screws removed. I recommend kind of sticking them in here so that way you don't lose them. You can see we have some sort of sound dampening material here on the back. And I should also point out that one of the bigger advantages of inverter generators is they're quiet. So it's very quiet relative to something on the larger side. So basically on the back end here, you can kind of see all the machinery that goes into it. The big one to point out here is going to be your oil right here. And it does come with this this funnel to actually fill the oil, and it comes with your first amount of oil, whatever you need for your initial starting it up. However, they recommend you change your oil after the first 5 hours. And on that note, it does take 10W30 oil, so definitely gonna want to have some of that on hand. And on the first 5 hours thing, let's talk about that here real quick. So when I got this in, basically I started it up, I let it run for like 30 minutes. And then I hooked it up to the electronics that we were using it with, which at the time was my refrigerator and computer, and I believe also my internet router. and basically I was getting some really steep spikes, I guess you could say, in the power, or rather in the engine RPMs. You could hear it just kind of going up and down, up and down, up and down, and eventually it would sort of shut off. So this is during Hurricane Florence, and I called the folks over at Champion who are actually in Canada. Their customer service team's in Canada, so they're like super nice, and I guess they drink maple syrup or something all the time, but super nice folks and very, very helpful. And basically I explained to them what was going on. They said that it's an issue with the carburetor, essentially, whereas the injectors in the carburetor, they need the first 5 hours, basically what they said is, and it's probably in the instructions and I didn't read it, is that for the first 5 hours that you run it, which is also the same amount of time for the first oil change, so that kind of lines up, they recommend running it on econ mode only, and that's sort of the break-in period for it. So they basically told me just, hey, you know, you've been running it for about an hour, run it on econ only for the next 4 hours, change the oil, do it again, and go from there. So I did that, and I never had that problem again. So there is sort of a break-in period for it. So if you guys are planning on using this during a storm, just know that you can either run it for 5 hours beforehand during a storm, or before you go out on a camping trip or whatever the case may be, change the oil and then you'll be ready and good to go. Or just plan for that first 5 hours that you use it to do that. So just wanted to point that out there. So you change the oil after the first 5 hours and run it on econ for the first 5 hours. And after that, it ran perfectly smooth, which you guys are gonna see here in just a second. So I suppose let's get to the actual operation of it. For the initial operation, of course, you're gonna wanna put the oil in like we just talked about, put that in. Then we're gonna wanna put our fuel in here with our gas cap. And one thing I noted earlier is that my gas cap was busted. The reason for that, guys, is I had during the hurricane kind of like a temporary waterproof shelter over it, and it collapsed due to the wind and knocked the little vapor seal off the top. I called the folks over there at Champion after the hurricane was done to kind of see if it was an issue, even though it ran just fine. And they said, no, it's not an issue. Just make sure you don't get any water in there. So we didn't get any water in there. We're good to go. So I just want to point out that you are going to have the little vapor seal thing on there, but put your fuel in there. I think they recommend 85 or higher grade. And one thing I would point out for folks who don't know is that if you're going to have this, during a storm or something like that, where you may need to store the fuel before or after, I recommend getting ethanol free if you can. If you can't, it will run on ethanol, added gasoline just fine. Just make sure you drain it afterwards, because that's not good for the generator. All right, so at that point, basically we're gonna put our engine on the non-economy mode, engine on, turn our gas valve on, pull the choke out. And at this point, we're gonna start it. This thing hasn't been started in about a week and a half, so we'll see how it does here on the first pull. We shall see. All right, and one thing you'll notice is that it's kind of loud here on the initial start, and it's the loudest it's ever gonna be. Put the choke in, that will cut down on the volume, and then put it down there on the economy mode, and it's really quiet at that point, like super quiet. I should also note here that we do have our exhaust here. They recommend 5 feet, I believe, or 1.5 meters for those of you guys who are overseas. And at this point, guys, it's good to go. You're ready to run stuff off of it and power whatever you'd like. So just kind of as an example here, I brought out this fan because I figure in power outage situations, that'd be one thing people would be interested in, is a fan. Stick that sucker on, turn our fan on, and as you can see, you're good to go. I should also note here that we do have output. The light does come on, the green light, when you're actually running anything. If you're not running anything, as you can see there, it stays on, but it doesn't spike. Like if you run anything that's like really high power output, you'll hear the engine actually change the RPMs initially, and then it'll go right back down, it'll step back down. That's one of the cool things about inverter generators, but it works just fine, as you guys can see. If you needed the fan to cool you off after a hurricane or something like that, it would do the job just fine. I'm gonna shut it down. 2 different ways to kind of shut it down, 2 sort of mentalities on that. Number one, you can just turn the engine off with the switch here, or you can actually just flip the fuel switch, and that way it will actually burn all the fuel that's in the engine. For like long-term storage, that's probably the way to do it. If you're gonna use it again here in a minute, it doesn't really matter, and we'll just shut it off. by hitting the kill switch there. Hopefully the audio wasn't too terrible there with it running, but it really is quiet. For a generator, it has this kind of output. It's super, super quiet. Just a few other points I wanted to touch on before we close the video out. One thing that's cool about this generator is that it's stackable. So like we talked about earlier, 2,000 watts, 1,700 watts, 14 amp output. When you actually stack these, because you can put two of these on top of each other, they're built to work that way, and then wire them together, I believe the output more than doubles. I think it goes to 30 amps in terms of output. So if you need more power than what you get here, you can double it, and you can do that just fine. And everything we talked about in terms of being quiet, consistent output, all that stuff stays the same. You just get more power. So speaking of power, what can you actually power with this thing, right? So my refrigerator, which is relatively new, it's one of the smart green electronic type of refrigerators, was powered just fine by this. I also powered my computers, my internet modem, router, my TV, and I think one fan during most of the storm just fine with this particular unit here. I've read online that folks who have like RVs and stuff like that are able to power their AC units just fine with these. That said, of course, it's going to always depend, right? So if you have like really older technology that's going to draw a lot more power, that might not be the case. Same thing with the refrigerator. If you have like a 1980s refrigerator, this might not power it, but most of your newer, smart energy stuff will be powered just fine by this. And that really is probably the biggest thing that most people are going to be concerned with during a storm, either refrigerator power or having like a window AC unit. And everything I've read, I didn't test the AC theory, but everything I've read says that like a small window AC will work just fine being powered off this generator. So that's what you can power off it. And the last thing I wanted to point out is going to be cost. So depending on where you look, these things are going to run generally in the $400 to $480 range from what I've seen lately. I will drop a link down below for those of you guys looking to pick one up. But like I said, compared to like a traditional generator that's not an inverter generator, with that same amount of money, you could generally get something that's going to be about double the power, but it's going to be heavier. It's not going to be as fuel efficient, all of those sorts of things. And that fuel efficiency, I didn't really kind of harp on it earlier, but during a disaster, whatever the case may be, or power outage can be a big deal. Here during Hurricane Florence, gas stations pretty much throughout the city were out of power for about a day and a half. So that fuel efficiency is huge. When you need it, it's big, it's very important. So that is one thing to consider as well. But is it for everybody? Nope. Is it for a lot of people? Yeah, I think so. It's going to help most folks get through an emergency without losing all the food in their fridge, without their kids complaining that it's 95 degrees and humid in the house, whatever the case may be. And it's going to give you electricity, which is also nice, of course, just to communicate and do all the things that we take for granted here in America in 2018. And the beauty of this is that you can just take it and throw it like up in your attic or in your basement or something like that, and really never have to worry about it until you need it again. So very convenient in terms of that. I think I mentioned it earlier, but if you're not going to use it and you are going to store it, take the gas out, just simply because that's what it's designed to do. It's not designed to keep the fuel in there for that long. It's just not good for the engine. But that's pretty much it, guys. If you have any questions about this, by all means, let me know. You can always post down below in the comment section. I know this isn't what I really focus on here on the channel, but it definitely falls in the gear category and the disaster preparedness and just the prepper and being prepared overall sort of side of the channel that we do touch on here from time to time. If you guys like what you see, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Thank you to all of you for watching, and I hope to see all of you in the next video. What are you talking about? Gotta be quiet. You gotta be quiet, girl. We're doing a video.